Hello and welcome to another edition of Tisky Sour Quarantined. Of course, it is not just us who are quarantined right now, but as of 8:30 this evening, the entire country. That's right, Boris Johnson has put the country into a complete lockdown. I'll be talking about that tonight with Aaron Bastani. We'll be talking about what all of this means. How are you doing, Aaron? How have you taken the news?
I'm good. I mean, it cemented everything we've sort of been talking about and expecting over the weekend. But as we were saying before we kicked off, I mean, just the spectacle of him making a live broadcast kind of appeal to the country, etc. It does feel historic. It does feel momentous. And I guess that's the point. There's a certain media sublime at work.
Let's watch a bit of that clip before we discuss its contents.
That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person, and travelling to and from work.
So we'll go through some of the big announcements there. So obviously the main one, you're only allowed to leave your homes for very limited purposes. That includes shopping for basic necessities, one form of exercise a day, for any medical leave, or to travel to and from work when absolutely necessary. People are warned not to meet friends or family members who they do not live with. Shopping is only permitted for essentials like food and medicine. Police have powers to enforce the rules, including through fines and dispersing gatherings. All shops selling non-essential goods, such as clothing and electronic stores, are ordered to close. Libraries, playgrounds, outdoor gyms, and places of worship are to close. All gatherings of more than 2 people in public, excluding people you live with, are banned. All social events, including weddings and baptisms, are banned. Funerals are not included in the new restrictions. Also, people can still have those. Parks will remain open for exercise, but gatherings will be dispersed. Restrictions under constant review and will be checked in again in 3 weeks. They will be relaxed if the evidence shows we are able to. I mean, this is the kind of lockdown that we've seen now in Italy for a while, in France for a while, and in Spain. Goes slightly further than I think what's been announced in Germany, although they took some of the more common sense actions earlier than the UK did, such as closing non-essential shops. Britain have kind of gone all in one go. There was quite a long period. It was only on Friday, I suppose, when they were keeping pubs and bars open. Then it's at Monday, and now we're in full lockdown enforced by the police. I mean, I think if this were to be replayed, probably the more common sense thing to do would have been to close down all of the non-essential businesses a while ago and then see if we needed to have a police enforced lockdown. But at this point in time, this seems like probably the only option that was available to the government. Aaron, what do you think?
Yeah, it does feel like it's the only option available. And it feels like some of the briefing that was going out over the weekend was effectively preparing for this. A lot of the blame being cast around, particularly at the feet of Dominic Cummings. I'm not saying he's blameless. I'm sure there is a great deal of blame to be put at his feet. But clearly people are looking for a figure at the very top level of the Conservative Party. We'll talk about how for some people that's Joe Public. But I think, there is going to be a reckoning within the Tory party over the next couple of months, the next year maybe, in response to this. It'll happen preferably after the national crisis is resolved. But you could kind of read between the lines this weekend, I think. I was still surprised, though, at the extent of them, like you say. No more than a couple of people. No weddings, okay, you expect, but basically anything but funerals. No kind of public assembly whatsoever. I would have thought baptism or weddings if there's 5 or 6 people, but no. Which is
5 or 6 people at a wedding is not really a wedding, is it?
No,
so
but
like a sort of Las Vegas midnight wedding or something like that.
You need a priest, you need a witness, you'll need a bride and a groom. That can't happen. So this is significant.
You talked about the blame game. We do want to talk about that because I suppose, well, we don't know at what point the decision was made to go into this lockdown right now, but it does seem like the ramping up of the government response was in some degree choreographed to be viewed as as being based on the government having to enforce something more authoritarian than they wanted to because the British public simply couldn't behave. This was what was dominating the news cycle over the weekend. I want to go to a prime example of that, which was the front page of the Telegraph. So that's Boris Johnson's paper of choice. They led on Sunday with NHS facing Italian-style crisis if we don't stay at home. says PM. And then it continued to dominate the news cycle today. Matt Hancock on Radio 4 this morning.
Why, in your view, are people ignoring the advice?
Well, I don't know, because it's very selfish. If people go within 2 meters of others who they don't live with, then they are helping to spread the virus. And the consequence of that costs lives, and it means that for everyone, this will go on for long.
And so that was an example of what has been the principal talking point this weekend, the idea that government advice has been to stay at home and to avoid socializing, and people just aren't following it. People can't be trusted. There are a couple of problems with this, and especially with that Sunday Telegraph headline, which is to say, if people don't follow these advice, follow Boris Johnson's advice to socially isolate or socially distance. Obviously, it's changed quite recently. It's been all over the place. But the idea that if we get into an Italian-style crisis, it will be their fault. It will be the fault of these selfish people. Now, what's ridiculous about that particular idea is that because of the time lag when it comes to coronavirus politics, whatever happens for the next 2 or 3 weeks will already have been locked in. So however many people decided to go to a market yesterday or went to a park and sat in a group of 4 people, whatever happens over the next 2 or 3 weeks, however many bodies we see piling up in NHS hospitals or however much we see ICUs completely over capacity, it is obviously I wasn't sitting in big groups on the park on Sunday. I don't think it was a sensible idea. But this idea that we can blame those people for what happens next is ridiculous. That's because of the decisions which were made by this government over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The other problem with it is that I suppose what the government are trying to suggest is that the reason that we had to implement these authoritarian measures now is because people weren't listening to us. They were going out and socializing and doing non-essential things when we told them not to. But there is a problem with all of that, right? And the problem with all of that is that a bigger problem than a bunch of people going to a park and sitting fairly close to each other, which the Deputy Chief Medical Officer told us just a week ago was not particularly high risk anyway, because it's difficult to spread the virus outside. The bigger problem is that people are still going to work, and people are still going to work because up to this point, I presume it's ending now. It'd be very bizarre to announce all of this complete lockdown and still have people going into office jobs to work on social media, which was happening today, right up to today. That has been the bigger problem throughout all of this, and people not following advice, which, as we've said many times on this show, has been completely inconsistent. Anyway, we'll go to a couple of sort of examples of this. So this was a tweet which was shared very widely over the weekend, and photos like this were all over the news for the last 24 hours of people who are going to a Sunday market to buy plants. And this is on Columbia Road in Hackney. And the idea is, what are these people doing? That the NHS is under strain. This is completely immoral. The problem is it's not really a morality tale. The issue here and the big story here is that flower sellers still so many weeks into this crisis, when the government have been able to see what has been going on for weeks if they were just paying attention, self-employed people still haven't been offered a way to financial security without going to work, which is why people were still setting up market stalls on Sunday. And to be honest, actually, an issue with this announcement now is it doesn't seem to have come with any greater commitment to the self-employed to say that now you're locked in your home, we're going to make sure that you are that you're financially secure, that you don't have to pay for this crisis. Aaron.
Yeah, also bear in mind, look, you're a florist. You have a pitch at Columbia Flower Market. There's Mother's Day. You spend thousands of pounds on stock that you're going to push, and then the government hasn't specifically prohibited you from selling that stuff. You're already in the red. You've already lost an absolute ton of money. You already know business as usual is gone for the rest of 2020. Unless somebody specifically tells you not to sell those flowers, of course you're going to do your best to keep your head above the water. And like you say, that's accentuated by the fact that self-employed people haven't really got anything to speak of so far from the government. Secondly, there will have been many people at that market. Obviously, the picture's not particularly good; it's bad, and that obviously is a haven for the transmission of the virus. There are many people who would have done their shopping, food shopping, and then would have gone to that market. There are food markets in and around there in Hackney as well. What's the difference between going to a supermarket and buying some flowers there for Mother's Day, which many people did, by the way, over the last several days? And that, it's a very headline-grabbing image. But like you say, I think the morality tale, yes, okay, it makes for easy headlines. Yes, it makes for easy people to blame. But I think it's bad politics, and B, it's a bad explanation.
I mean, we can look at a survey that was done. I don't know if it was done for The Guardian, but it was written up by The Guardian. So they asked people on various different contracts how likely or how able they would feel to miss work if they were unwell. So it's quite a specific question. If you specifically were unwell with coronavirus, would you feel able to miss work? Almost 50% of self-employed people said they would feel obliged to go to work, even with symptoms of coronavirus. And it goes up to 55% for those on 0 hours contracts. So obviously you might think, look, there's a lockdown now. Whatever self-employed people feel in terms of their capacity to go into work, they can't now. There's been an authoritarian response, which in this case is probably appropriate, to say, you can't go to work even if it does make you worried about your finances over the coming months. And hopefully the government will come up with some kind of response so that people don't lose out during this crisis. But the reason this does matter is that we are going to see over the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the kind of, well, hopefully not quite as bad, but we're going to see images which look similar to what's going on in Italy right now, which is that you have ICU units completely overwhelmed. You have numbers of dead rising increasingly, dramatically. And we need to make sure there is not an attempt to blame people who were buying flowers on a Sunday market, but remind people that we had a government who, up to Thursday, we had a prime minister who was telling people that he would go and visit his mum on Mother's Day 4 days later. And the Friday before had told everyone who was young to go out and get herd immunity. And then on the Monday of a lockdown, so let's go to the next image, actually, because this is even more, shocking than people buying flowers. This was rush hour this morning on the London Underground. So you have, the government has said it is the number one priority so that our NHS does not get overwhelmed, that people follow social distancing practices, they don't get into close proximity with people who aren't members of their households. And then at 9 a.m. in the morning, you have people rammed onto a tube. And the reason, this is one of the biggest aspects of mismanagement during this crisis, I think, which is that they reduced the capacity of public transport networks before they ordered non-essential businesses to close.
I was in London on Friday. I was in London because I had to pick up a prescription before anybody comes for me. And I don't live in London anymore. And the train going to London was like normal. Okay, there were just as many trains as there usually would be. And there's a train every 20 minutes. And then I went back, and of course we did a show on Friday night, as our loyal viewers will remember. And we had to delay that because basically I was waiting in London Waterloo for 90 minutes for a train. Train after train after train was cancelled. So that was first of all, that was quite noticeable. But then, of course, on the train coming into London, nobody was in my carriage, maybe one person. On the train coming back, like you said, it was half full. And I don't mind it being half full, but the point is, statistically, one of those people was, I think, likely to have the illness. And it was going to make it more likely to transmit it to, just keep business as usual up with regards to trains up for a few more days. I think they still should do it, as well as having an explicit prohibition on certain people using those trains. The idea that we should concentrate more people into a fewer number of trains is really, really short-sighted.
And I suppose the extent to which business was going on as usual, not because of irresponsible working class people going to parks, but because businesses were allowed to continue as usual, was demonstrated very clearly by this picture, which was tweeted by Dan Dobson this morning. And this is, a full room full of people who have gone to work on construction sites. So the tweet reads, "Construction sites are open as usual across the UK. This photo was taken 20 minutes ago on a site at Waterloo." So it's sent it sometime this morning. "Contractors are refusing to shut sites until the government force them, so they don't fall foul of any contractual clauses." And so this represents better than, I suppose, any tweet and image I've seen over the last 3 weeks, the fact that the government strategy, which has been based on advising businesses to do X, Y, Z, or advising landlords to let their tenants off if they're struggling to afford rent this month, is, it was always ridiculous. And it was ridiculous because what working class people need in this situation is rights, not advice. If you've been told to avoid large crowds or whatever, but then your boss is telling you that you have to go into work, otherwise either you'll be disciplined or you won't get paid, and the only way for you to get to work is on a busy tube train, then it's obviously a complete nonsense that we've got a media class and a political establishment which is trying to blame the shit show that we're going to see over the next 2-3 weeks on people not effectively following advice, because there will be so many people who have contracted coronavirus over the last 3 weeks, or given coronavirus to someone vulnerable over the last 3 weeks, because they were doing what they had no choice but to do, which was to go to work.
Can I also say, let's put ourselves in the shoes of one of those flower sellers in Columbia Market. Let's say you employ a young person weekends on a Saturday, Sunday shift. God willing, you pay them a living wage, you're a good employer, etc., etc. You've already lost a load of money. Like I say, you're already in the red. You already know your business is probably going to go underwater this year. But you need to sell flowers on the Sunday, and somebody happens to take a picture there. And then your employee says, well, can I come on Sunday? Well, look, I'm already out of pocket. I'm paying you a living wage. My business is going to go under this year. Unless the government is specifically saying we can't do business, we're open as usual. And I would very rarely defend, a major construction conglomerate or multinational, Balfour Beatty or whatever, that might be administering the contract at Waterloo, whoever it may be. But people are answerable to other people in supply chains, whether it's Transport for London, whether it's Balfour Beatty, whether it's a regional, local body, etc. And if there isn't a message very specifically from the top, you cannot work in these places at these times unless you are these particular people, then people will do it. Because in a market economy, money makes the world go round. And particularly when we've got the environment, like I say, over the next couple of months, potentially even years, people will be looking to get every last minute of work in that they can, right? I mean, the next quarter, we measure economic activity in quarters. It's 3 months, obviously a quarter of a year. The next quarter in the United States, you're looking at, in some projections, some say -15, some say -25, a contraction of economic activity. There's never been that level of economic contraction in America in peacetime history. It's the sort of economic contraction you'd expect in the war. And so, of course, people are going to push boundaries in the days and weeks preceding that. They are.
We've got 2,000 of you watching now. We want to get that up, and we'll be doing these shows very regularly during this period. I mean, neither me nor Aaron nor our producers can leave the house, so what else are we going to do? But it does still take a lot of capacity to make this stuff work. We've had to buy new kit to stream successfully from home. So if you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You make this all possible. If not, please go to support.novaramedia.com and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. I know many people's financial situations will be all over the place at the moment, so do what you feel you can. If you've got a decent income but nothing to spend it on because you can't go to the pub anymore, give us an extra bonus. If you're in a flexible, if you've got a flexible contract and you've lost hours, then obviously we will forgive you if you don't feel you can give anything to us this month.
Can I also say smash the like button? Can I say that, Michael?
You can say that, Aaron. You can say whatever you want.
I love saying that. We've got 569 thumbs. We've got 2,060 watching. Let's get a couple of thousand likes before the end of the show, because if we get a couple of thousand likes per show, then I think we might talk about taking this nightly. I shouldn't say that, but I'm going to.
I'm going to take a couple of comments now as well. We'll go to them at the end as well. But Nicholas tweets on the hashtag Tiskisau. We love it when you tweet on that hashtag. The PM said you can travel to and from work, but only if you cannot work from home. This is not a lockdown. What does cannot work from home mean if your boss won't let you? That's an interesting question. That was definitely the situation up to this point in time. So the Prime Minister had said, work from home if you can. And actually, I'll go to it in a moment, but I've got lots of evidence of people who had jobs where they could have worked from home and their bosses told them to go in. I'm assuming, and I might be wrong, I'm assuming that the announcement today means that has somewhat changed. So at least the wording now that they're putting on the BBC website is you're only allowed to travel to and from work when absolutely necessary. I'm hoping and assuming, I could be wrong, that this announcement means that many more businesses will be ordered to close than were, for example, this morning. So I can't imagine, and I hope I'm not. I hope I'm not wrong. I can't imagine that tomorrow you will be seeing those same gatherings of construction workers about to go and do their jobs, because it would seem very odd whilst the lockdown is going on to let that happen. Although actually saying that, I mean, Rosa Gilbert, and this is another shout out actually for our now daily podcast, The Burner, hosted by James Butler. It was running all through the general election in December, and it will be running all the way through this crisis. The first episode this morning was was great, and I bring it up now because it included Rosa Gilbert, who is a brilliant left-wing thinker who is living in Italy at the moment, and she pointed out something which was not very covered in the international media that I've seen, that actually whilst this lockdown was going on in Italy, similar to the lockdown that's been announced here, actually there were factories which are open. So you did have many people going to a factory and building something which wasn't required for containing the coronavirus crisis. It wasn't people who worked in a car factory that was now producing ventilators. It was people who were just working in a car factory. Those weren't closed down in the lockdown because you had a situation where the government thought, look, we have to do everything possible to contain this crisis except damage or collapse the economy of Britain's most powerful industrial region, which Lombardy is. So maybe there will be a battle actually about that in terms of what the government considers to be essential or non-essential work. That'll definitely be something to watch over the coming days. Len Grinder also tweets on the hashtag, the UK government may have been making bad decisions for the past 2 or 3 weeks, but the biggest damage has been done by the fact they made no decisions at all for 2 or 3 months before that. We must avoid the narrative that this crept up on us from out of nowhere. Absolutely right. I 100% agree, Len Grinder. We're actually going to talk in a moment about new information that's come out about, the decisions, the controversies and the inaction that has been going on at the top of government over the previous weeks and months. What are we looking at now? I do want to go to a couple of, so in terms of this, who had to go to work this morning when they would have probably much preferred to have stayed at home, and when medical advice would have told them to stay at home for their own health, but also because, there are young people moving around who aren't at risk aren't at a high risk in any case of having serious or facing serious consequences from coronavirus, but should be staying at home anyway because you're in danger of spreading it to vulnerable people. And we could all be carrying it. We don't know. So people who didn't want to go to work but had to go to work this morning, I put out a tweet today to ask for stories. I'm just going to get some of them up to show you how sort of like widespread this is and how unnecessary so many instances of people going to work today were. So Sarah Wiley tweeted, yep, social media controller for a car company. My request to work from home was denied, just in case all other staff request to work from home too. I have a company laptop and do not require being in the office. Right. So we've got a government who for 3 weeks, well, for months actually, not just for 3 weeks, but for months has seen this crisis coming, hurtling towards us all. And for at least the last 3 weeks, we've been able to see what's going on in Italy, and we've been able to see how big this crisis will be if we do not prepare. 3 weeks later, today, this morning, you had people who were forced to go to work on a social media job on a laptop in case a bunch of other people in that workplace also wanted to do the right thing, which was to work from home when they physically could. And it just seemed, it's just insane that we have had a news cycle all weekend about the fact that too many people went to the park on Sunday and potentially walked within a meter of each other, when the government has allowed it to be the case that people who are social media controllers for a company, so someone who sends tweets, that they had to go to work at rush hour on the tube this morning, potentially giving coronavirus to people with a vulnerable person in their household, potentially giving it or getting it from an NHS worker, because the NHS workers are saying, they're also on these tubes at rush hour. Like it's just the height of irresponsibility. And we really have to make sure that this fuck up cannot get blamed on too many people who went to the park.
Can I just say that, I mean, Michael, what's your opinion here? Would you blame the employer or the government, or is it a bit of both? Because let's say that employer is just juggling so many things. They're not that plugged into the news. They might watch the 6 o'clock news once every week. They might see a snippet of a front page, and the last thing they heard about coronavirus was Boris Johnson saying, take it on the chin, because whatever we think about him, one of his political gifts is having this ability to evoke metaphors that, quite deep in British culture. Take it on the chin is a really strong piece of imagery in British English. And I think that's the last kind of thing that people would remember. Another one was he talked about rice, sort of like vermicelli when he was talking about broadband networks. It was a really evocative way of using language. And so, do you blame the employer? Do you blame the government? And I think it does boil down to, ultimately, these people have immense concentrations of power. The reason being they're elected by all of us as holders of public office to act in the public interest, the public good. And so, I blame the employer to some extent. I mean, clearly the employer's being an idiot. And by the way, that job as social media controller for a car company, that should be remote 90% of the time anyway. Maybe that's one good thing that can come out of this crisis, is that many more people understand the actual the superiority of remote working. Often you can concentrate better, you can do more deep work in an environment which is quiet, which isn't an open plan office. But ultimately, I think we have to blame the government here. I like you say, we have to avoid morality tales. And on the left, we like to sort of criticize bad bosses, etc. And we'll keep on doing that. But I think when it's a public health situation like this, when it's a pandemic, you have to have enforcement and very strong, affirmative, propositional language, not urging, not asking, not pleading. And so I think in the complete absence of that, I think all the blame has to go squarely on the government.
Well, I think the buck obviously stops with the government, and also, I mean, we've been told for decades that free market capitalism works well, and it works well because when you have companies who are trying to be as productive as possible and make as high profits as possible, so long as they don't break the law, that's supposed to lead to optimal outcomes. And so if you are a business owner, you've been trained to believe that, look, my job here, it's the whole point of shareholder value, So business owners have a legal obligation in many cases to maximize shareholder value. And if you as a boss think that maximizing shareholder value means that you have to make a social media officer take the rush hour to take the tube at rush hour in the middle of a pandemic to work because that's how you think you're going to get the most content out of them that day, then as a profit maximizer, that's what you're supposed to do. I mean, I assume her boss is an idiot, and if I don't think he would be putting the dividends of his shareholders at threat by saying you can work from home today. It sounds like he's a job's worth. But
he should follow Novara Media on Twitter, and he could stay a bit more informed.
Exactly. But I think you're 100% right that this, the buck stops with the government, and the idea that you can advise businesses and hope that, that will be enough is for the birds. It was always ridiculous. The government should have realized it weeks and weeks and weeks ago. I just want to go through a few more of these tweets because it is shocking, what jobs people were sent to today. Matteo Tiratelli, who's a friend of mine, actually, he says, my mate worked in an auction house for ancient coins. And they're still going in. So on Monday, this evening, we've had this momentous occasion where, the Prime Minister announces an unprecedented lockdown. We are in, the worst global pandemic since 1918. And 3 weeks into this crisis, when we've already got more than 300 people dead, and we're potentially, a week away from the deaths being in their thousands, we've got people who are on the tube at rush hour this morning to go and sell ancient coins. I mean, presumably they've been around for millennia. You didn't have to go into work and sell them this morning. And obviously that's not a moral claim about the person who went to work. He was told to work by his boss. And the nature of employment in capitalism is that if you think you know better than your boss, you still have to do what your boss says. And that's the situation that so many people have been put in today and been put in over the last few weeks. I mean, there's lots of kind of blurred boundaries about what is socially necessary work. In terms of what constitutes care work, clearly cleaners are hugely important parts of the economy. What kinds of cleaning labor is going to be, is urgently necessary, right? What kinds of cleaners need to be out there? Clearly you want refuse collection, etc. But in terms of the fundamental workers that now need to be treated as people who absolutely have priority in being able to continue to do their jobs. Look, antiquarian coin dealers are absolutely at the bottom. That is absolutely not socially necessary work. Kind of insane. I mean, almost like you said, you raised it for a reason. It's ridiculous. It makes your point exquisitely well. And, no shade to people who sell ancient coins. It's a completely legitimate way to, pass your time and to make a living. But when you're in the middle of a global pandemic, people who sell ancient coins should not be going to work. I want to go just to one more example. I'm not going to go to all of them because there were loads, but Graphic 9, which is from Kat, and this was probably the most outrageous one of them all. So Kat writes, I've had to commute to work on 2 crowded buses each way, open plan office with shared computers, so hot desking.
Oh my God.
I have chronic respiratory conditions, including severe asthma, but they said to come in as I don't have flu symptoms. Meanwhile, bosses, 6-figure salaries, working from home. And I mean, this single tweet, this single reply, I mean, tells you so much about this crisis and tells you so much about modern capitalism, right? So as we said on Friday's show, and what Torsten Bell, who's director of the Resolution Foundation, was quite good at sort of bringing to light last week, was that whilst all of this was based on advice, whilst people who were on, the tube at rush hour last week were quite likely to catch coronavirus, but had been advised to stay at home, the people who were able to take that advice were wildly disproportionately likely to be higher earners. So he found that in the top 50% of earners, 1 in 2 people could work from home. They did the kind of jobs that could work from home, and also they probably had, the kind of power in the workplace that meant they could ask for that and get it. Only 1 in 10 of people in the bottom half of the wage spectrum could work from home. So these people who've been forced to get on 2 buses a day, even if they have respiratory problems, because obviously the government haven't introduced any new rights, which say your right in the workplace is that if you've got asthma, you don't have to go to work over the past 2 weeks. It's all been based on advice. And because it's been based on advice, it's going to have shocking consequences for public health, which we're going to see over the next week or 2. And it's been, presumably really distressing for a lot of people who are in vulnerable situations or who live. And this is the big one, people who live with people. So there'll be many people who don't have respiratory problems like Kat has, but who live with someone who does. And so think, why am I going to work to do my desk job, which I could quite easily do from home, but my boss isn't letting me? And every time I'm going out and coming back, I am putting in danger my partner or my mom or my kid, who is more vulnerable to the consequences of coronavirus. And this is what the government's dithering over the last three weeks has made inevitable. I suppose the final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of why it's ridiculous to blame the public is that the government advice has been fucking all over the place. So the issues we've just been talking about is that the government haven't given enough, they haven't made enough orders, one, to businesses, and they haven't given enough rights to ordinary people to be able to make, or for their advice to be able to be, followed effectively. But even when it comes to their advice, it's been shocking. So on Thursday, some of you will have seen, Johnson said he would try and visit his mother on Mother's Day. Then at 10 p.m. the day before, so 10 p.m. on Saturday, he says, oh, actually, this would be a terrible idea. Now, that is not good government comms. People have to, people are saying, why aren't people following government advice? But for the last week or so, government advice changes every day. So are we judging people for not having watched today's Boris Johnson announcement as opposed to yesterday's? Because yesterday said it was fine to visit your mum, and yesterday said it's good for you to go to the park, and then today says if you go to the park you're actually murderous scum. So if you're to remain a moral person in this particular era, do we all have to watch every Boris Johnson speech and completely forget what he said the day before?
No, so you're entirely right. That's why this whole show, shifting the blame, that's the last thing that we should allow to happen. Ultimately, it sits with government, and it's like you said, it's been a strategic communications disaster, and that's been months in the waiting. It's been weeks in the waiting. You've seen it for weeks, unless your name is Aisha Hazarika or Jonathan Friedland. But most people, I think, have seen this for weeks. But realistically, in terms of emergency contingency planning, nation states, especially wealthy ones with 65 million people like Britain, should have been isolating COVID-19 as the crisis it was, I think, at least in late January. The kinds of measures we're seeing now should have been quite clearly articulated to the public in late January. What are we talking about instead? Boris Johnson's paid for holiday in a tropical Caribbean getaway, or bunging a bob to get Brexit bonged. Come on. This is a real, and that failure of strategic communications, yes, the government is to blame, but my God. The media wasn't on this either. Not that it's their job.
Lost Aaron for a second there. Maybe, I don't know if our audience have as well. I assume you have, because the cameras come back to me. While we try and get Aaron back, actually, I am going to show you an example of far better strategic comms than what was managed by Boris Johnson, which is a series of Italian mayors.
Voi non è previsto il ping pong, non potete giocare a ping pong, andiamo. alla PlayStation. Siccome io sono il sindaco di questa città, in questa città il decreto lo faccio rispettare io. Quindi se ne devi andare a casa adesso, non vogliono scuse. Tutti, dovete stare tutti a casa, devi andare. Non si può stare in mezzo alla strada, come ve lo devo spiegare? Non si può stare.
I mean, that plays into a lot of stereotypes about Italians, but that whole clip, actually, I tweeted it last night. In Italian, you say crystal clear, you say cristallino when something is crystal clear. I mean, you don't get more crystal clear in communications than what those guys are saying. You know, don't fuck about, get indoors. And this is something, you know, Michael, we're going to go back to the talking about that lady who was working as a social media controller for a car company. If she has COVID-19, if she's a carrier, and she goes into a workplace with 10 people, she is the equivalent of anthrax going through the letterbox in a letter. She's like a mini biological weapon. That's how seriously we need to take it. And that's something you see with those Italian mayors. Why are they doing that? And that's because more than 5,000 Italians have died as a result of this illness. Now, they've died not because Italy's healthcare system is bad. Actually, Northern Italian healthcare is some of the best in the world. In terms of doctors per capita, doctors per head, Italy has far more doctors than Britain does, has far more ICU spare capacity than we do. They're dying really in the numbers because they have a very large older population. But I think once people see the extent of that, you know, if you live in a country where 5,000 elderly people have died, where all your ICUs are packed, then I think it becomes so visceral and comprehensible to you, you behave like that. So perhaps we're 1 or 2 weeks away from British politicians acting in a similar manner because they themselves will have seen just how egregious the consequences of not acting in time are.
So, I mean, we're talking about the government's appalling communications over the past 3 weeks, and in terms of, you know, their inaction and slowness when it's come to responding to this crisis. You would expect in this situation, really, at least some of the media to hold them to account. And now you might not expect the Telegraph to hold them to account because obviously this is a Tory paper, and particularly a Boris Johnson lined paper. We've also come to expect that many of the key editors at the BBC or ITV or Sky News, namely all of their political editors, are, you know, fairly appalling at doing anything other than being government press officers. But you would expect that potentially, you know, the country's liberal newspapers, they would put up a little bit of opposition, but no. Even Guardian commentators have been way more interested in holding the British public to account than the government. So let's go to this tweet by Jonathan Friedland today. He says, when this is all over and there's a public inquiry into how things went so calamitously wrong, there will be many culprits, but one culprit will be us, the public. I mean, that's just ridiculous, isn't it? When this is all over and there's a public inquiry into how things went so calamitously wrong, there will be many culprits, but one culprit will be us. I mean, is that true? I don't think it is, Jonathan. You know, he's in quite an insulated profession, I suppose. But I don't think that's the case. If we just carry on, there's a few more examples of this. You've got Jonathan Friedland, and then, of course, you've got Have I Got News for You? This was a tweet from the 13th of March. Chief Medical Officer confirms UK stance on coronavirus, directly contradicting statement from fellow pandemic expert at Dave 2398126395 from Wigan. Obviously taking the piss out of the quote-unquote every man, every person who would have brought something like that to attention on social media. Turns out Dave was wrong. Have I got news for you? I was right, rather, and they were wrong. And also today they did a similar post highlighting some people, you know, queuing outside a supermarket. I don't think Fox can bring that one up. Maybe he can. It's appalling. And actually, what it speaks to is not just a bad political opinion. It speaks to a fundamental misanthropy, a fundamental disdain, disregard, dislike for the mass, for the average person in this country. They think they're thick. They think they're stupid. You know, Owen Jones wrote a great book about this, chaps, about depictions of ordinary working class Brits. And this dovetails with that very well, particularly with the Jonathan Friedland piece. Oh, we're going to blame the public. You know, we're going to blame the public, except everybody I know. It also dovetails very well with our next story, which is, you know, obviously that Have I Got News for You tweet there was making this joke where why would people think they were intelligent enough to question the government when the government are getting scientific advice and the public are just idiots? Well, it turns out have I got news for you, or whoever writes your tweets, that Dave from Wigan, in many cases, had a better understanding of what the government should be doing than whoever the fuck was advising them. And this became apparent on the weekend when lots of the discussions that were going on over the previous weeks and months have been made public, or at least have been briefed to various journalists who are in the know. And there were two big stories, one on Saturday and one on Sunday, where so one of them was Alex Wickham in BuzzFeed, and he was talking about how there was a big battle in the government over what advice to take, and what this shows. Actually, I'll get up some of the quotes first. So we've got this is one of the choice quotes. So after the updated imperial modelling came out showing 250,000 deaths would result from the herd immunity strategy, the experts who had been demanding this for days wondered what the lost time would mean in terms of deaths. They also raised concerns that the government must be completely transparent with the public, questioning why Valance later chose to describe the difference between the mitigation and suppression strategies as semantics. This will all come out in the mother of all public inquiries, a source said. So whilst all of Britain's political editors were telling us that why the hell would you question the government advice? They're in the know, you're idiots. And they were saying, there's nothing political about all of this. It's just objective science. There were people in the government who were screaming, this strategy is wrong. And probably those people in the government who were screaming this strategy is wrong would have quite liked it if some of the country's journalists were brave enough to question what has now turned out to be incorrect advice. And obviously, I suppose to properly introduce this was the herd immunity strategy, which the government had adopted for up until they changed their tune on Monday, Monday, when they said that actually we don't want everyone to get this.
When was it ditched last weekend? Was that when herd immunity was officially ditched last Sunday? Right? I mean, it feels like it was months ago, but actually it was like a week ago.
Yeah, well, so according to the Alex Wickham article, so when the herd immunity strategy became publicly known and publicly popularized was when the head of the Nudge unit had briefed it out, I think on 2 Wednesdays ago. And then you had Johnson's first big press conference, which was 2 Thursdays ago, with him and Valance and Whitty on either side, so the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer. And that was when they said, we don't want to shut down too early because we want enough people to catch this, that some sort of herd immunity develops. You had Patrick Valance, who went on the radio afterwards to say, or to explain this herd immunity strategy. Very clear about it. And I took from that, and I think a lot of people did, that what they wanted young, healthy people to do who weren't vulnerable to the worst consequences of coronavirus was to go out and basically get it, right? And then over the weekend, they were shown modeling which said that actually you've got this completely wrong. 250,000 people will die if you take this course of action. That was when, and according to Alex Wickham, this was the evening after that press conference, they decided that, actually they have to switch strategies. And then the country didn't find out that they dumped herd immunity until last Monday, so 7 days ago.
I mean, yeah, things have been happening so rapidly that it feels like a month ago. But we did that show with Steve Turner last Wednesday, and it was fresh off the back of that. Can I just say, we've got 2,300 watching, 2,356. Let's get to 2,500. And we've got 1,200. Smash the like button. If everybody watching smashes that like button, you'll make us both very happy. Gary has already given us tacit permission to go to a nightly show. Let's prove the point, and let's get as many likes as we can. If you like the show, if you think more people should watch it, go to the description. You'll see a link for the show. Share it on Twitter or wherever else. If you're going to do it on Twitter, #TiskiSour, and get some questions in on that hashtag, also in the comments with some rocket emojis. We'll get to those shortly. Over to you, Michael.
I just want to go to one other. So I want to now go to the Tim Shipman article. The whole Alex Wickham one is worth reading, but there was an explosive quote in the Tim Shipman article, which sent Twitter wild, quite rightly, I think. And so this was Tim Shipman talking about how the policy had changed over the last 10 days, and a passage from it was. Dominic, so we'll go to graphic 14A. Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's senior aide, became convinced that Britain would be better able to resist a lethal second wave of the disease next winter if Whitty's prediction that 60% to 80% of the population became infected was right, and the UK developed herd immunity. At a private engagement at the end of February, Cummings outlined the government strategy. Those present say it was herd immunity, protect the economy, and if that means some pensioners die, too bad. right? So this was precisely what on the last 2 weeks we've been talking about on Tysky Sow, this idea that this strategy that government have adopted, which, I mean, one, doesn't look like it's going to make sense, because it's only simple maths to work out that if 60% of people get coronavirus, and it's got a 1% death rate, then a hell of a lot of people are going to die. More than 500,000, or 600,000. But also, what we were saying on all of our shows was that even if this herd immunity strategy turns out to be correct in the long run, it's incredibly high risk. Why not err on the side of caution and say, when we know so little about this virus, when we know so little about how it can be effectively treated, and when we don't know how far away a vaccine might be, why would you take the riskiest option possible, which is to say we won't even try and repress this virus, we'll let it run wild, because we've got some quirky idea which no one else in the world has adopted. And this, for weeks and months now, up to last Monday, up to 7 days ago, was the government strategy.
I mean, Dominic Cummings, there's a book, I think it's by John Kay. Somebody maybe can put it in the comments. I think it's called Obliquity. And basically, it's, if you ever want a winning strategy, you need to do the last thing that would kind of come to mind. And that's apparently a recipe for high risk, high return strategies. Okay, that's great. We talked about this on the show before. If you're using some zany strategy to win a referendum using Facebook ads by dumping millions of Facebook ads in the final 3 days of campaigning, knock yourselves out. If that doesn't work, you'll lose the referendum. But in terms of managing a public health pandemic, in terms of hundreds of thousands of lives being at risk, it probably makes sense to err on the side of caution and to be risk averse. The thing with Dominic Cummings, and this falls into this isn't even a political thing, it's a personality type thing. He's an arch contrarian. He has to be different to everyone. He always knows best. Okay, that makes sense for a referendum in regards to an assembly for the Northeast. It works if you want to work for Michael Gove in education policy, although teachers and their unions might disagree. It was a terrible policy, by the way, but he managed to get it through. And it works in regards to the 2016 referendum and last year's general election. This is public health. You need to be ultra, ultra cautious. And somebody like Dominic Cummings, with his personality type, is absolutely, categorically, the last kind of person you want at the top.
Let's finish this section with one tweet, one comment by someone who still thinks that after this entire shit show where everyone has recognized that the government was adopting a stupid policy for weeks, which has put many people's lives at risk and will cost many people's lives, still doesn't think that ordinary people should be able to criticize or question the government's actions. So this is Sarah Vine, graphic 15. To all those sniping at a government trying to cope with one of the fastest moving national emergencies in a generation, you haven't got a fucking clue, and not an iota. Either come up with something constructive or zip it, ideally the latter, for fuck's sake. Sarah Vine is a male journalist. She's often on Andrew Marr's sofa. She also happens to be Michael Gove's wife. There are a number of things wrong with this tweet. Obviously, we've been talking for ages and for previous shows about why better policy will come out of people criticizing and asking questions of the government. But the other bit is this idea that the critiques of the government haven't come up with anything constructive, right? So people haven't just been saying, oh, what the government are doing is shit, but we haven't got any alternative. What people have been desperately, screaming for weeks is to say that this is a highly dangerous disease. Herd immunity is not going to work. And what you should do is do what other countries have done. What other countries have done was test. That's what they did in South Korea. That's the best option when faced with a pandemic like this, because it means that, as they've done in South Korea, you can actually continue life largely as usual, because you've got such a high-tech developed system of working out who's got coronavirus and who they've been in contact with, that you know exactly who to quarantine, and everyone else can get on with their business as usual, which is what's going on in South Korea. That's the ideal thing to do. If, as was the case in Britain, we didn't have the capacity to do all of that testing because we're shit at investing in the health service and we're not very good at planning into the future, then what you should do is lock down, try and contain the virus for as long as possible whilst you develop that capacity. That's what countries like Italy are doing. Instead, we took some mad herd immunity strategy, which has put hundreds of thousands of lives at risk. And now Michael Gove's wife, Sarah Vine, male journalist, often on Andrew Marr's sofa, has the temerity to say, well, what would you have done? What would your alternative have been? It's like everyone was screaming out the bloody obvious alternative. It's like, it's just an insane rewriting of history.
Yeah. And I mean, look at Norway, look at Germany. They've got far more known cases and they've got a far, far lower mortality rate because they're dealing with this effectively. And also, one more thing about Sarah Vine, incidentally, she's a Leeds hospital baby truther. Do you remember the small kid that was on the front page of a local newspaper, then on the front page of the Daily Mirror in the last general election? And then certain senior journalists sort of said, actually, this is fake, it's staged. Sarah Vine retweeted one of those people. And then the weekend before the general election, I believe, Michael, maybe you can correct me, was on the Wednesday, I think, or the Thursday. It was midweek. The Sunday
general election
in December, yeah.
It was on a Tuesday, I think. They're normally on a Thursday, and this
Tuesday,
time
that's Tuesday. On the Sunday before the general election, Sarah Vine was on Andrew Marr's sofa. And I'm thinking, wait, hold on. A couple of days ago, she was retweeting a Leeds baby truther. And now she's telling people, what to think in regards to print papers, one of which, like you say, she works for. Her husband, Michael Gove, formerly a journalist, I think he was at the Times. He writes also for The Spectator. I mean, people like this, couples like this, they speak to the complete disintegration of the British media and also the disintegration of any sort of boundary between media and politics in this country. The husband is a politician, but wait 1 second, he was the first person to interview Donald Trump for a British newspaper. Michael Gove did that, by the way, for the Times. The wife is a journalist, and yet she's making bizarre apologia for government action, including distributing claims, publishing claims, which is what you do when you retweet people, that actually the photo of that child being treated on a floor in a Leeds hospital, that was faked. These are the people who actually determine far too much of the national conversation in our country.
So I think we're going to finish tonight's show discussing, the latest decision by the government to suspend the rail franchise system before going to some questions. But I know, Aaron, that you've been following this story very closely. So I want to hand over to you on this.
Yeah, so if we can just pull up graphic 18, this is from the Financial Times this morning. Pretty extraordinary news. It's not a nationalisation, it's a suspension of the present franchise agreement. This is the quote from that article. The British government has suspended the rail franchise system in a move that effectively it's not a nationalisation, but effectively nationalises any, it's the important word, losses by railway companies for the next 6 months as the disruption from the coronavirus pandemic hits passenger numbers hard. The Department for Transport announced on Monday that it would temporarily end normal franchise agreements and transfer all revenue, there will be no revenue, and cost risk, there'll be lots of that, to the government for at least half a year. Operators will continue to run services day to day for a small management fee under a emergency measures agreement. Ministers said the alternative, allowing railways to enter insolvency, would have led to even more disruption and greater cost to taxpayers. Now, this is really interesting. This isn't nationalisation. What we're seeing is an outright explicit socialisation of any losses, and we're paying a small fee to private rail operators to still carry on. We're paying them to do what they would do anyway, whilst making the taxpayer pay the bill. Socialising losses, privatising gains. And it's been estimated by the TUC, maybe we can get this up, Fox, this is figure graphic 20. It's been estimated by the TUC that we've seen £1 billion go to shareholders in the last 6 years. So when there was profit, that was put into private hands. But now that these firms are going to go into loss, well, of course, the taxpayer is going to be burdened with that. And this is a classic example of the limits of free market ideology. You privatize the gains, you privatize the profits, you socialize the losses. I mean, it's never been more brazen, but wowee. And by the way, when will we go to business as usual? It's 6 months, okay? But let's say coronavirus, COVID-19 is even worse. Let's say we don't have profitable private train operators in this country for 2 years. It will stay in public hands until then. The second it's profitable again, it will go back into private hands. Wait, hold on a sec. Can't the taxpayer recoup their money at least? Or how about this? If they're making money, why don't we keep them in public ownership and use the revenues for that to pay for improving trains or to make tickets cheaper? It's almost like private rail operators in this country is a rigged system. Makes you think, doesn't it, Michael?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is also going to be the key, element of the politics of coronavirus over the coming weeks and months. I think the key issues over the last 2 months and weeks have been sort of the key decisions that have been made that have cost or saved lives. So how long was the government how long did the government follow stupid strategies? And I think there will I think there probably will be a public inquiry about that. But I imagine that over the the coming weeks, most countries will stabilize into a set of policies whereby, they recognize the nature of the crisis that is coronavirus. They recognize how infectious it is. And in terms of what is the policy that optimizes health and minimizes deaths, I imagine we might come to some kind of consensus about that. And what we will end up arguing over is, who pays the price? So who pays the price for cleaning up all of this mess? And also, do we have to go back to, the absolute status quo, however shit it was before coronavirus happened, right? So there will be many people, and, I think this is one of the explanations for Boris Johnson dragging his heels during this whole crisis, is that he recognizes that many interventions that you can make, which are beneficial to public health, will legitimize having a state which has a big role in industry, will legitimize collective action, will legitimize the idea that actually people behaving as self-interested individuals without much concern for each other. He thinks that he thought that if you have that response, the collectivist response, the only actually suitable response to a global pandemic, that will legitimize all of the elements of politics that he hates. And that's why he dragged his feet. And that's why we had advice, this sort of idea that actually maybe we could just let everything continue as normal and a bunch of people who are economically inactive will die anyway. He's realized that's politically impossible. And now what you're going to see is the government intervene as much as is necessary, but in such a way that they are desperate not to legitimize government action, even if it is, the most rational way to run society in a bunch of these different ways. I mean, go on, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, look, people the most outrageous, unfair tax in Britain today. I mean, it's probably VAT actually, but apart from VAT, is council tax, and council tax was a fudge, as James expertly pointed out on the burner this morning, our new podcast. Council tax, as it's presently comprised, was formulated as a response to the bodged poll tax, and so a temporary measure can actually last a very long time. And so, like you say, it's really important that we sort of forensically examine government steps in terms of who is being made to pay for this crisis. And things which we're being told are stopgap measures may actually be for much longer than we think, or much longer than the government intends. I think it's a really important thing to remember. The council tax system we have today was only ever meant to be temporary. 30 years later, it's still there.
I mean, there is an argument that businesses will make, which is to say that, look, this crisis wasn't like, and this is what Boris Johnson has said, this crisis wasn't like the financial crisis. It wasn't endogenous to the free market system. It was a virus. And so just as workers shouldn't pay for it, businesses shouldn't pay for it. The problem with that, and I do think there is something to that. We can't say that just because you have to nationalize XYZ during a time of crisis, it should be nationalized in usual times. Maybe nationalization only works in that time of crisis for certain industries. But the problem with that argument, to say that the crisis we find ourselves in now has nothing to do with politics outside of this exceptional moment, is that why have we invested so little in ventilators? Why is our healthcare system at absolute capacity bursting at the seams even before coronavirus came along? Why is the state so weak that it can't respond to this pandemic in the way that South Korea has, or in the way that China has? Not that we want to mimic the Chinese system, but one thing you can say is their state capacity is much greater than our one, and that was incredibly beneficial in a time of a pandemic. And who is it that has argued for lower investment in health services, lower taxes, having a weaker and weaker state which outsources all of its functions to private industries who can't behave in a strategic way? It is these big corporations, and it is these neoliberals. So this idea that this particular crisis that we're living through now has nothing to do with the politics which preceded it is a nonsense.
Can I say, I know you want to go to questions, but I just want to quickly say, Michael, this is important. You're right. This is an exogenous crisis. It's like the oil crisis of the early 1970s. The point is, that's life. There are exogenous crises all of the time. And the ideology of free market capitalism, the sort of the market fundamentalists, Hayek, von Mises, Friedman, who inform the whole sort of underpinnings of sort of modern neoliberalism. It's a thing. It exists at the level of policy, politics, and also everyday common sense. Goes to people like Alan Greenspan, Sajid Javid. Both have been, voracious readers of Ayn Rand. Markets are always better. States are always worse. Now, let's interrogate the point, for instance, around bringing rails into effective de facto public ownership. Why have we done that? They're effective critical infrastructure. Why are they critical infrastructure? Because some people need to use them to get to work. Well, okay. In normal times, if I need to get to work using a train and it's unaffordable, what are you going to do about it? Well, nothing. Why? Because the market decides. You can see how incoherent that logic is. Okay, how it makes absolutely no sense. It's veneer, it's a veneer of rubbish. And so I agree with you. No, of course, there'll be some things you may want to bring into public ownership temporarily. But that means two things. It means, firstly, a recognition by the wealthy and the elite that actually the state is there for all of us in hard times, not just for them. You can't have JSA for people under 25, which is £65 a week, and yet the aviation industry gets billions upon billions upon billions until we get a vaccine. That's the first point. Secondly, they're going to have to pay more tax, because the next time there's a response to an exogenous crisis like this, who's going to pay for it? Surely the wealthier should pay for handouts ultimately that are down to their benefit more than anyone else. I mean, again, these seem to me like quite commonsensical arguments, but look, we don't want to go too far over, so I'll leave it there.
Let's go to some of your questions. First of all, I'll read out some of your comments already. And yeah, keep putting your questions in. We'll go to a few of those. March Lungley tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Should we have a shame list of companies who have stayed open longer than needed? And March Lungley has done a cough and said, Pret. I heard that Cafe Nero took quite a while to close. I'm not sure did Pret as well. In any case, we'll have to look up these particular businesses, but I think that when, if the corporate media aren't successful in suppressing any kind of accountability of all of the events which have happened over the past weeks and months, and I'm sure that Laura Kuenssberg, Robert Pesson and Beth Rigby would be perfectly happy if every action and mistake which happened over the last 3 weeks was buried and never looked at again, because they don't seem to think that scrutiny is part of their jobs. If they don't have their way, there will be a history written of these moments, not written in years and decades, but in the coming months. And there will be some people that look really fucking bad. A lot of them will be in the Tory government, and a lot of them will be the kind of bosses who told people that even if you can work this morning, even if you can work at home, you have to come into work this morning during rush hour, because otherwise other people might want to work from home. There are going to be some people who look really fucking shit because of the decisions they've made over the last 7 days. Dr. Eleonora de Ilia tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. I love you guys, with a heart emoji. Thank you. Thank you for existing and actually doing good journalism. Good journalists seem to have been self-isolating for the last 10 years. Wow, I thought it was going to say 10 days, 10 years. Lots of them have, yeah. I mean, there have been some people who are worth reading over this period of time, but yeah, I think we'd probably concur that there have been too many government stenographers who we see too often on our TV screens, really, who just want to repeat whatever the government press release is. And I'll ask this question. We'll go to Aaron to answer this one as well. Oliver Can ask, and also gave us a $5 on the super chat. Thank you very much. Shout outs to Mike's plant collection. Thank you very much. I have to say, I don't really tend to them. That's what my partner does. Do you think the government will use this crisis as an excuse to slash rights, perhaps permanently? Aaron, what do you think?
No. I think I mean, look, this may be played back to me in 5 years, and look how wrong you were. I do think this permanently changes the terrain of market capitalism, and I think it really does undo a lot. There's a great article today, I think, in Tribune. It was written by Jerome Roos, just really chronicling how heavily indebted financialized economies unravel, and very quickly, if we have a suspension of business as usual for even just a few months. What is debt? Debt is a promise of future payment. What is a promise of future payment? Well, it's effectively a future promise of labor. And if all of a sudden we think, we probably can't work, or we can't produce in the manner that we take for granted for 6 months, for 1 month, for 18 months, for 2 years, all of a sudden debt as a way of running and ordering the economy becomes very problematic. Jerome Roos, he's got a great book out on this. He had a great book on the sovereign debt crisis of Europe a couple of years ago. Really great article in Tribune, and I really implore our viewers to read it. In terms of how I think that dovetails with the question asked about labour rights, and will this mean kind of shock doctrine for free market capitalism, taking away even more than what we have? Of course, that's what happened in 2008. People were saying this is the end of neoliberalism. Actually, it just descended to a new plane of exploitation and sort of predatoriness. I don't think that's plausible this time, simply because so many businesses will go under. I think it's really important to remember that in 2008, trillions of pounds and dollars of liquidity were put into the global financial system, banking bailouts, part nationalizations, lines of credit. Why did that happen? It happened to avert precisely what we're now about to have, which is a contraction of economic activity in the United States of between 15 and 25%. We're going to see the biggest economic recession in peacetime ever is going to happen this year. So do you come out that the other end and actually get more neoliberalism? No. I'm not entirely optimistic. I think that the costs of this crisis may be put on the backs of the poor, but I think that the old cliches, the old self-evident nostrums, the old wisdom about markets are always best, you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, I don't think that's going to work. I think it's been very hard to give somebody a pittance for JSA sickness benefit when you've given the aviation industry tens of billions of pounds.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'd add to that I do think this crisis will probably have different effects to the financial crisis in 2008. I mean, one, because it has shown the necessity of having a state which is capable of intervening strongly in an economy and having public services which have a high degree of slack in them. What I'm hoping is that this crisis completely delegitimizes the idea that efficiency savings, which means running your public services to the absolute limit in normal times, is a good thing. And I do feel like the argument for long-term state investment, not just in infrastructure but in public services, will hopefully be won by this, after or during this crisis. But it is worth noting that in the same way that you can say this crisis looks like it is structured very badly to be taken advantage of by shock doctrine neoliberals, you could have told the same story about 2008, right? 2008 was a crisis which, in that case, it was endogenous to the neoliberal banking system. It should have delegitimized free markets in finance. And again, states paid billions and billions and billions of pounds to bail out banks, and that should have been an opportunity, or you would have thought that would have favored the left, because people would have said, if you've given hundreds of billions to the banks, why are you so fucking miserly when it comes to unemployment benefits for people who, maybe you'd like them to go get a job, but they haven't done anything. They haven't destroyed the economy in the same way that the bankers have. But then, there was a political struggle, and who won? In most cases, the right. And there will be a political. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I just think, look, first of all, I think it's different. 2008 was a financial crisis. It ultimately didn't really become a major economic downturn. A financial crisis became a crisis of sovereign debt, because we socialized the costs of that, and it became a very difficult thing to politicize. Of course, the apotheosis of that was the Greek Eurozone crisis, after Syriza come to government, the third bailout agreement, etc. This is different. Now, for instance, let's say we start getting mass evictions. I remember in 2008, there wasn't really a political consciousness around that. What kind of trade unions would respond to that? Now you would have the CWU, you'd have the FBU, you'd have leaders of the teachers' unions, maybe the UCU, you'd have Unite Community, you have ACORN. So I think the left is in a fundamentally different position. Okay, Jeremy Corbyn's no longer leader of the Labour Party. Okay, Bernie Sanders, we shouldn't say this now, but he's probably not going to win the Democratic nomination to run for president later this year. You didn't have frontline politicians like these guys, or like a Richard Bergen, or a David Lammy, or a Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez politicizing these things in that way. There was a real absence. You're saying it was a political struggle in 2008. It wasn't. It was a walkover for the right. It was a walkover. So I think the left is in a fundamentally stronger position this time to politicize the facts and make clear, actually, what's happening is not inevitable. There is a political choice to be made here, and all the decisions don't need to go against working class people.
All right, I think we are going to leave it there, but we will be back tomorrow night at 8 p.m. this time, unless there is another sort of shock announcement that we have to wait for at 8:30. I just want to say, someone has said on Twitter that when I was saying this announcement feels like there won't still be people, going to work tomorrow to do essential jobs. Apparently, the wording of the government announcement is unless you absolutely cannot work from home. So this is a live story which will continue following. But if you are someone who does what you consider to be a non-essential job and you have to go to work tomorrow, please DM me on Twitter at Michael J.S. Walker, because we'll talk about that tomorrow, because I think this could be really one of the big struggles going forward, which is who has a right not to go to work during the middle of a lockdown. In any case, thank you so much all for watching this evening. I hope your lockdown goes well and that you have everything that you need in the house, or if you don't, you can get it in a not particularly difficult way. Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure. Great show. I'm so happily we're doing this nightly. It's fantastic.
Absolutely. And we'll get on to some of the international stories as well tomorrow. We'll talk about Cuba and whatever else happens during the day. You've been watching Tysky Sour. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.